Welcome to On the Other Hand, and a special welcome to Oleg G, Ain't Got No Name, Q Layton, Ian Hoggy, Demon King, Felipe Portea, and any of the new viewers to this episode of Divisive Definitions. As a quick announcement, in addition to BitChute, I've now also mirrored my channel onto Library/Odyssey. It's a free open source alternative to YouTube, and it's always nice to have backups. Anyway, I often hear the phrase, it isn't enough to not be racist, we need people to be actively anti-racist. I understand the sentiment. We want people to be actively making the world a better place, not just not making it worse. However, I also think this presents a false dilemma, because the term anti-racism has some baggage that comes with it that I'd like to dive into. First, we have the whole issue of how we define racism. For this, I'd like to show a clip from one of my favorite channels of all time, Counterarguments. And as always, links will be in the description below for the things I reference. This counterarguments video specifically talks about the difference and conflation between how we use the term racism and talk about institutions and individuals.
The argument goes that black people can't be racist as individuals because black people can't be racist via institutions. Racism can be discussed in either one of these contexts, but they are nonetheless two different contexts. Sociologists, the same people who are apparently responsible for the prejudice plus power model, agree that racism as an ideology exists both at an institutional level and at an individual level. Sociology draws a distinction between the two. But this argument doesn't. The only way it works is if you conflate the two, and failing to differentiate between different contexts is not a very responsible nor intelligent thing to do. This is not to say that these two never overlap, they do, but treating them as one and the same is not reasonable. We wouldn't conflate institutions and individuals on the subject of religion or activism, so why would we lump them together when it comes to racism? Context is vital to communicating effectively. Once you start muddying those waters, it isn't long before you encounter the inevitable failure of communication.
So even before we get into what anti-racism is, there's the entire argument of how we define and measure racism, which people disagree on. So that's fun. But jumping into anti-racism itself, I found what is hopefully a good sample of people who promote the anti-racism movement. I found this specific segment on PBS, so hopefully it's a non-controversial take on what the movement thinks of itself, and they start the conversation with their own definitions of racism and anti-racism as follows.
So thank you all again for joining us, and let's start off our discussion today, but with a definition of racism, and this was pulled from Racial Equity Tools. And we're going to define racism as different from racial prejudice, hatred, or discrimination. Racism involves one group having the power to carry out systematic discrimination through the institutional policies and practices of the society, and by shaping the cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practices. And racism equals race prejudice plus social and institutional power. Racism is a system of advantage based on race, and racism is a system of oppression based on race, as well as a white supremacy system.
Thank you for that definition of racism, Mike. So let's go ahead and talk about what anti-racism is. It is defined as the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. Anti-racism tends to be an individualized approach and set up in opposition to individual racist behaviors and impacts. To reiterate, anti-racism is actively opposing racism.
So I do appreciate that they define their own terms for this livestream so that they can be specific in what they're saying. But on the other hand, I don't like that they feel the need to redefine words for this conversation. Here I'd like to turn to a clip from The Amazing Lucas that inspired this whole series on divisive definitions. And this clip talks about how important word definitions are.
So you guys know how much I've talked about the importance of words, right? The importance of speech, the importance of language, and how certain groups and certain communities are looking to target exactly that, the words that you use, because they know once you change the words, once you change the speech that people use, well, then the culture naturally aligns with that. For example, phobia, right? Phobia is a medical term denoting an irrational fear of something, but when coupled with other words before it, now it becomes something completely different. Now it becomes a sword that they can use and wield and slice and dice anything and anyone who has a dissenting opinion. Anything that possibly could conflict with what they believe, their ideology. And this leads us to Webster's Dictionary. Now, I know what many of you guys are asking. What about Webster's Dictionary, Lucas? Get on with it. Webster's Dictionary has included the word they as a non-binary pronoun. And I know that may not be a big deal for some, but you should understand it is a very big deal. Because when it comes to their ideology, when it comes to justifying their beliefs, whatever asinine or perverse notion that may be, they need authoritative sources. I know that falls back into, well, what are authoritative sources, right? Well, I say the dictionary is a pretty good authoritative source. When you talk about, well, the World Health Organization, well, the World Health Organization even said that they declassified this and now it's okay. The DSM-5 has even said, well, now this is no longer a mental disorder. This is okay. This is fine. And what happens is that it makes it easier, let's say in an argument or in a debate. You can say, well, the dictionary even says this, Lucas. World Health Organization even says this, Lucas. The DSM-5 even says this, Lucas. And slowly, inch by inch by inch by inch, you start to look like the crazy person. You, in fact, start to look like the bigot that they love calling you. Because it's like, yo, Lucas, everywhere else, the world is progressing. The U.S. is progressing. Seems like you're the only one who doesn't want change to happen. Seems like your bigoted ideas are what's holding you back from the progression of this country.
I feel like Lucas did a good job talking about how words and conversations are actively being redefined to fit specific narratives. Now, I'm okay with the meanings of words changing over time. What I'm not a fan of is when definitions get changed to fit a narrative, much like during ACB's confirmation hearing. When people attempt to change words that fast, it just leads to anger and confusion. Anyway, back to anti-racism. Here's the next section from the PBS clip that I thought would be interesting.
Taking what Dr. Love said and moving it into the school context, we have to do all of those same things. The majority of the teaching force is white. Over 86%, closer to 90% of the teaching force is white, which means the majority of the Black and brown students in this country, all Indigenous, Black, and other people of color in this country, the children are spending the majority of their time being educated and in some ways brought up by white people. White educators do not share the same cultural view of the world, cultural lens that people of color do. You cannot know what it is to live inside a politicized body, especially if you have not wrestled with your privilege, especially if you have not experienced what Dr. Love was talking about, the physical and the emotional and psychological violence that is pervasive throughout the school system and the world. So even if I sit here in a reasonably healthy body, even though I talk about my blood pressure all the time, because most of us have elders in our family with extremely high blood pressure, just from a life of living among racism. And when they say racism kills people, it does, literally. If not through police brutality or violence, it kills you because of the things that it does to your physical body. So knowing that kindergartners go into school and have to fear being expelled or suspended because the expulsion and suspension rates for Black kindergartners are astronomical. Knowing that Black girls, as Monique Morris talked about, get pushed out of school early and consistently. So the fact that we managed to graduate and make it through the other side is such a miracle. Knowing that our multilingual, our bilingual, our Latinx students are told that their bilingualism is a deficit, that there's something wrong with them because they speak more than one language. All of these things are what Dr. Love refers to as the spirit murdering of our children. And if that's hard for you to take, then you need to think about the racist within you, because I don't personally believe that it's possible to grow up in this country and not be racist. We are steeping in a racist stew.
There's a lot to unpack here, like the race of educators and students, politicized bodies, psychological violence, speculating on causality of differing outcomes, and the spirit murdering of our children. On the one hand, I definitely understand the desire to show the unfair treatment that some people get in society. But on the other hand, I don't like how often people who are pushing the anti-racism narrative seem to paint those affected as victims who are unable to act for themselves. I'm really also not a fan of terms like psychological violence and the spirit murdering of our children. Violence is horrible, and I feel like using violent language to describe the thoughts, words, and intentions of others makes it far easier to justify real violence to combat perceived wrongs. Also, I can understand the desire for children to learn from those who can more closely understand and reach out to help them. But on the other hand, I don't like this fixation on wanting outcomes to fit certain racial quotas. If people live in a free society, different people will choose different things. That doesn't mean we should ignore disparities, but it also doesn't mean that disparities are necessarily something that needs to be fixed. I'm a fan of limiting restrictions so that people can choose for themselves. Now, this idea of being able to choose comes back to a word associated with anti-racism, and that word is equity. Kamala Harris put out a video on this recently, and here is Benjamin Boyce discussing that video.
So what happened was that yesterday, the two of the candidates for high office, being Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, made a series of statements or tweets that trigger me. And I have to be completely honest about that triggering because they brought up, Kamala brought up the concept of equity and said that it is not the same as equality. And here's the 1-minute video.
So there's a big difference between equality and equity. Equality suggests, everyone should get the same amount. The problem with that, not everybody's starting out from the same place. So if we're all getting the same amount, but you started out back there and I started out over here, we can get the same amount, but you're still going to be that far back behind me. It's about giving people the resources and the support they need so that everyone can be on equal footing and then compete on equal footing. Equitable treatment means we all end up at the same place.
Which video doesn't really make sense because the first part of the video is about getting people on equal footing, and then that very last statement of the video is about everybody, working really hard and then arriving at the same place, which is not possible. Sam Harris, in her defense, said that he took her seriously, but not literally, or something like that. Seems like Sam Harris has some motivations behind calming down the outrage from my side of the conversation, which is against equity, which is, sees equity, sees it as this rebooted sort of communism, this equality of outcome. And other people are like, politicians pander, politicians lie. It doesn't mean that they are actually going to do that. But the way that government works is that it has two basic areas where they really do implement equity. And by equity, they really do mean equality of outcomes.
So the question is, how does one measure equity? On the one hand, equality of opportunity acknowledges that people won't always have the same starting points, but ensures an even playing field. The measure is the evenness of the playing field. On the other hand, equality of outcome looks for results and tries to alter the field to make the results the same. The measure is the outcome. Equity seems to try to do both at once, just like the Kamala Harris video showed. However, if one wants to mandate the results, that mandate always requires a restriction on freedom. For example, No Child Left Behind sounds like a good idea until you realize that the control needed to close disparities did a lot of harm in the name of doing good. Now coming back to the PBS livestream, here's the last clip I wanted to show from that.
And I think it's really important for folks to move past the stage of, okay, I can't say the R word. Okay, I whisper Black. Okay, I want to use all these euphemisms within the educational environment to talk about what's really going on. We need to use the language of racism to talk about racism before we can even begin to dismantle it. That is, to me, what being anti-racist means. You start with your language and you are very aware of all of the ways that you as an individual, we as groups, and then education as a system is contributing to the spirit murdering and the physical violence and the emotional and psychological violence that happens to our youngest people, our children, and they carry with them throughout the rest of their lives.
So this focus on being careful with language is interesting. I personally want to be as kind to those around me as I can, but the level to which it seems like anti-racist activists push sensitivity seems to be pretty staggering. Going back to Benjamin Boyce, here's a clip of him giving an interview on the Probably Problematic podcast, talking about the importance of good intentions to this anti-racist movement and diversity trainings in his own college experience.
They come in to give us these trainings, right? And the trainings are about how to properly, how to be a good person, basically. They use all this terminology for just being a good person that treats people fairly and, just recognizes that the other person is another person and you're just going to be polite. That's basically what they're trying to do.
Okay.
But they dress it up in all this privilege talk. And what Rashida Love does, which was the director of that part of the college, and she kind of, she works in later the story, I don't know if we'll get to her, but she says, okay, we're going to teach you about privilege. And so what she does is she makes this chart on the whiteboard, and it goes race, sex, sexuality or sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, and like these different categories of character. And then she's like, well, who's privileged and who's not privileged, right? And so they go and on the whiteboard, they're like white, male, Protestant, middle class or upper middle class, and all these different, and straight. And this is before the days of cis, right? So they didn't put that one up there yet. But it was Evergreen was there, right there, like pushing that stuff the next year. So we had to do the pronouns next year.
Right.
But I was looking at that, I'm like, this is the first thought, and I know you're not supposed to say this because it's a very, very tired trope, but the first thought that I had, and this is before, I think, this is before Trump, so it wasn't just the go-to slander. I'm like, this is exactly what Hitler did in Mein Kampf. It's like, who is the privileged? And the privileged they got that way because they thieved from everybody else. This is a zero-sum game. Privilege oppression is a zero-sum game. It sets you up for reparations, and it's not just monetary reparations, though they want monetary reparations. The problem that I have is when it gets into moral reparations. And that's what this Robin DiAngelo white fragility stuff does, is that it causes you to think of yourself as privileged. You find your privilege. And especially if if you're a dominant characteristic, you find your privilege, you meditate on the way that privilege itself and participating or not actively demeaning yourself by divesting yourself of authority, of position, of power, of resources, of in the moment, of not silencing yourself. If you're not constantly in the act of prostrating yourself in these variety of ways to that other person, then you are perpetuating this dynamic of theft, this dynamic of always being oppressed. And so what it does is it boxes everybody in. And that's what I saw right away. And I was sitting next to a black gentleman, a black student, and I'm like, and we were supposed to talk, we're supposed to talk about our privileges. And I looked at him and I'm like, I don't reduce people into these categories. And he's like, I don't either.
I feel like this is a good take on critical theory and intersectionality, both of which are closely associated with the anti-racist movement. I feel like everyone is trying to make the world a better place, and trying to be kind towards everyone around them. The problem I see with this anti-racism is that in the process of trying to bring problems to the floor to be looked at and solved, they intentionally push for others to start looking through the lens of an immutable characteristic in order to make the world a better place. And that seems rather divisive to me. Speaking of diversity trainings, I'd like to pull here from Dr. Karlin Borisenko, who is an organizational psychologist and who recently left the left. Anyway, I appreciate her insights into the field of psychology, and she has practical knowledge in the realm of diversity trainings and the like. So, here's an interview she did discussing anti-racism and diversity trainings on a channel called Trigonometry.
Most people, when they hear anti-racism training, like that's a good thing, right? I mean, you want to train people not to be racist, right? If you can help it, that'd be fantastic. So when you talk about anti-racism training, the indoctrination you're talking about, and that it doesn't work, just explain to someone who may be less aware of everything that's happening, what it is that you're talking about. What are people being taught? What are they being told? What are they being told they have to do now, etc.?
Well, I mean, it is brilliant branding, isn't it, for anti-racist training? It's very Orwellian. It's very Orwellian branding, because what they're essentially saying is you as an individual do not matter. You are not an individual.
I've been telling Francis this for years.
You know,
It's Russian background.
And in fact, being an individual in terms of an anti-racist framework is actually part of a white supremacist culture in organizations. You know, and other components that they're going to teach you as part of the white supremacy are things like meetings, or writing things down, or having goals, or being on time. These are all part of white supremacist culture in organizations that need to be dismantled in anti-racist training. Now,
Connor, are you exaggerating here?
No.
Or this is what they're actually saying, meetings are racist?
I am 100% not exaggerating. In fact, there is a 6-page document that I have that the city of Seattle was using in their anti-racism training about what is that white supremacy culture is, that enumerates every single one of these things, even expecting a high quality work product, white supremacist. And so, and the problem with this is these trainings come in and they teach you all the ways in which you are a white supremacist at work, but they don't offer alternatives. They don't say, here's what we should do instead. They come in and they say white supremacy bad, and they very literally make you confess your sins if you're a white person, because they're also, by the way, this is why I say anti-racist training is Orwellian. The city of Seattle, when they did their mandated city anti-racist training, segregated it by the races. There was a separate training for white employees of the city of Seattle than there were for black employees of the city of Seattle.
Did they have separate drinking fountains as well, just to spice things up?
Well, they probably did, and I'll give you even one better. The white employees were asked to come in on a vacation day that they had already planned to participate in the anti-racist training, voluntarily, of course.
Wow. So they were segregating people because of their race to receive different training. And I think the question is, like, haven't we made this mistake before?
I mean, it's separate but equal, if there ever was a case of it, isn't there?
Yeah.
Right.
No, but they never offer an alternative. They basically do when they come in and do this training is they say all of these things that white people have brought onto the organization, these are all bad, and so we have to dismantle them. Now, an extra thing I'm going to throw in here is I've actually analyzed that 6-page document that they say is all white supremacy in organizations, and I'll tell you this: absolutely none of those things in organizations have to do with skin color. A lot of the grievances they have actually have to do with the work styles that people bring with them to work. So your work style is things like how you communicate, how you collaborate. Do you like to work at a fast pace? Do you like to work at a slow pace? Are you open and friendly? Are you more questioning and skeptical? All of these things make up an individual's work style, and all of the conflicts that we see coming up that are grieved in this white supremacist document are all work style conflicts. I can explain every single one of them by saying this work style does this work style does not. And so they're trying to frame it as though this is an issue of race. All white people do this, all people of color do not. And it's just not true. And there is no evidence to back it up.
So that's the big practical effect of anti-racism, that it is being used and taught in businesses and schools via diversity trainings. Now, people who push for anti-racism and critical theory might very well disavow these bad trainings and say that it is just people misusing and misunderstanding the concepts. The problem is for me that this feels like the no true Scotsman fallacy, much like the argument that socialism has never really been tried. So it's hard to see all these crazy things done in the name of anti-racism, yet not put any blame on the ideology that they seem to have in common. And if you want to dive into this ideology more, and man, it goes deep, I cannot recommend James Lindsay highly enough, especially this video of a recent talk he gave that I'll put a link to in the top corner and also in the description. So am I saying the people who push anti-racism are always racist in disguise? No. But I see some pretty racist things being done in the name of anti-racism. And I'm a big fan of judging people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. As always, thanks, hope you enjoyed. And if you did, consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you'll get notified for new uploads.